Hello guys, Dr. Spooks here. If you enjoy my videos, please click the like button. It's the only way YouTube's algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. The old clock on the wall of the ranger station ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Outside, the spring night was chilly, a reminder that winter's grip hadn't fully loosened yet. But inside, gathered around the fireplace, we were warm and comfortable. I leaned back into the soft leather couch, my eyes drifting from the dancing flames to my fellow rangers. There were 4 of us on duty that night, me, Harland, Anthony, and Craig. We'd been chatting idly for hours, our conversation meandering from topic to topic as the night wore on. It was one of those quiet shifts where nothing much happened, leaving us free to talk and joke around. These late nights were my favorite part of being a park ranger. There was something special about being out here in the middle of the woods, surrounded by nature, but tucked away in our cozy station. It reminded me of camping trips from my childhood, huddled around a fire, telling stories. Except now, instead of a campfire, we had a fireplace, and instead of sleeping bags, we had comfortable leather couches. The station itself was a testament to both function and comfort. Built decades ago from sturdy logs, it had withstood countless storms and seasons. The interior walls were adorned with maps of the surrounding forest, educational posters about local wildlife, and the occasional mounted trophy from bygone hunting days. A large desk dominated one corner, covered in paperwork and radios, while a kitchenette occupied another. But the heart of the station was undoubtedly the fireplace where we now sat. I glanced out the window where darkness had settled upon the woods with its usual silent thoroughness. During the day, this place was a park full of hikers, picnickers, and nature enthusiasts. But at night it transformed. The cheerful sounds of visitors faded away, replaced by the mysterious rustling of nocturnal creatures and the whisper of wind through the trees. It wasn't a park anymore. It was the woods, wild and unpredictable. Craig had just finished regaling us with a story about his cousin's recent wedding, a tale that involved a runaway ring bearer, a cake disaster, and an impromptu bagpipe performance. We were all still chuckling when Anthony turned to Harland, our most senior ranger. "Hey, Harland," Anthony said, his voice curious. "You've been working here longer than any of us. What's the scariest thing you've ever experienced on the job?" It was a question we'd asked Harland before. Usually he'd just chuckle and deflect, saying he'd heard some crazy things over the years, but nothing too scary. But this time was different. Harland's weathered face grew serious, the laugh lines around his eyes deepening as he furrowed his brow. "The Witch of Blackthorn Creek," he said, his voice low and grave. The change in Harland's demeanor was immediate and palpable. We all fell silent, our attention completely focused on him. Harland wasn't just our senior colleague. He was the ranger we all looked up to, the one we deferred to when things got tough. His family had been in this area for generations, their roots as deep as the oldest trees in the forest. If anyone had stories to tell about this place, it was Harland. Moreover, Harland wasn't the type to exaggerate or make things up for effect. He was straightforward, hard-working, and always ready to lend a hand when needed. So when someone like Harland tells you he's got a story like that, with a tone of voice that's dead serious and without a trace of amusement, you listen, and you listen intently. "The Witch of Blackthorn Creek," Harland began again, his clear voice cutting through the silence that had fallen over the room. "It's a story I first heard from my Uncle George, who was a lumberjack for many years. According to him, people used to say there was a curse on this land, placed here by a witch." Harland paused, his eyes distant as if seeing something beyond the warmly lit room. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, as he collected his thoughts. "It all started one year when the harvest went bad," he continued. "Now, you have to understand, this area had always been known for its plentiful harvests. Year after year, the crops would come in bountiful and healthy. So when suddenly there was barely enough grain to get through the winter, people got suspicious. It didn't help that the town had been going through some financial difficulties recently. What had once been a prosperous community was starting to struggle. I shifted in my seat, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Harlan's words painted a vivid picture of a town on edge, its people growing increasingly paranoid as their fortunes turned. Then, Harlan went on, strange things started happening. Houses would burn down for no apparent reason. People would go missing, never to be found again. And every now and then, someone would find something odd left near where a person had vanished. Creepy things like weird-looking dolls made from wood, the kind of thing that would rattle even the toughest person. Anthony let out a low whistle. "That's messed up," he murmured. Harlan nodded grimly. "It gets worse. See, there wasn't anyone in town that people thought capable of doing these things. But one of the families in town had experienced something similar in a different town many years ago. They started talking about curses and witchcraft. And when a few people who'd been keeping track of all these strange events realized they all took place on a full moon, well, you can imagine how that fueled the paranoia." He paused to take a sip of his coffee, which must have gone cold by now. None of us moved to refill our own mugs. We were too engrossed in the story. "It all came to a head," Harlan continued, "when there was a terrible accident at the town lumber mill. A fire broke out, and no one could figure out how it started. Several employees died, many others were badly injured, and the mill, which was one of the biggest employers around, had to close down. That was when all the fear and paranoia that had been bubbling under the surface for years finally boiled over. I could almost see it in my mind's eye. A town gripped by fear, people whispering in the streets, neighbors eyeing each other with suspicion. It was a far cry from the peaceful community I knew today. So when some people from town found an abandoned cottage in the woods near Blackthorn Creek," Harlan said, his voice growing quieter, forcing us to lean in to hear him, "with weird symbols written on the walls and floor, they didn't hesitate. They grabbed their torches, set the place on fire, and watched it burn." He shook his head slowly. "According to the stories, that cabin took forever to burn, much longer than anyone thought possible. But once it finally did burn down, they took the ashes and buried them deep in the woods. They didn't mark the location, hoping that would be the end of it." "Did it work?" Craig asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Harlan shrugged. "For a while it seemed to. But every once in a while something would happen that would make people in town look over their shoulders. Nothing major, a bit of bad luck in the form of an injury, or some suspicious noises outside the house after dark, maybe some scratch marks on the door or the wall. But ever since then people would be very careful what they did, especially if there was a full moon." He fell silent then, staring into the fire. The flames danced in his eyes, casting flickering shadows across his face. For a moment none of us spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the ticking of the clock. Finally Harlan stirred, as if coming out of a trance. "I couldn't tell you how old I was when I first heard that story," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I remember exactly how I felt, confused, because the story, although creepy and entertaining, didn't quite make sense to me. And I said something to Uncle George about that." A small smile tugged at the corners of Harlan's mouth. He laughed, said he agreed that the story was long on atmosphere and short on believability. That's when he got serious. Told me that although the story was a bit of fiction, he never doubted that it came from somewhere, and there was indeed something going on out in these woods. Harlan's eyes swept over each of us in turn, his gaze intense. Then he added something I've never forgotten. He said it didn't matter how old I was, where I was, who I was with, or what was going on. If I got a terrible feeling, I should listen to it. And I've listened to every feeling I've gotten since then. It's never served me wrong." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I'd had those feelings before, out in the woods. That sense of being watched, of something not quite right. I'd always brushed them off as imagination. Now, I wasn't so sure. "I've never quite believed that witch story," Harlan continued, "but I will be the last person to deny that in all the years I've been out here, I've felt things on occasion, things that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, And on even fewer occasions, I've seen things, fleeting glances at things that I wasn't sure I saw. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. But there was one time when I not only felt something, I heard something. The air in the ranger station seemed to grow still. I glanced at Anthony and Craig, seeing my own mix of fascination and unease mirrored in their faces. It was about 30 years ago, Harland explained, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he was no longer fully in the room with us. I was just starting out as a park ranger. This was back in the early 90s when technology and life in general was very different from today. I'd grown up out in nature and I'd seen plenty of scary movies, and more importantly, I'd grown up hearing countless spooky stories about what may or may not have been lurking outside, so I wasn't exactly sheltered, but there are some things you're never truly prepared to experience. The fire in the fireplace popped loudly, making us all jump. We were so absorbed in Harlan's story, we had almost forgotten where we were. I glanced at the fire, noting absently that there was still plenty of wood. We wouldn't need to add more for a while. It was early November, Harlan continued. Halloween had just ended, which made everyone sad because I remember that year was a particularly fun one. Darkness seemed to be arriving earlier and earlier, so I was barely halfway through my shift when the sun was going down. I remember it had been raining almost every day, so the days were all gray and cloudy, and the nights were damp with plenty of fog. I could picture it clearly. The gloomy days, the misty nights, the kind of weather that seems to blur the line between reality and imagination. But that particular morning was dry, Harlan said. All the leaves that had clung to the trees had been scattered by the winds and rain, so they lay there on the grass, all damp and torn. My job on that particular day was to go around raking them up so they didn't completely cover the trails and paths that people walked on. He shivered slightly, as if feeling a phantom chill. The chill in the air was that chill only late fall can bring, the dampness that seems to soak into your skin and never let go. I had just finished one section of the park and was walking back to my truck when the rain started up again, and it did so with a fury. Harlan's words painted a vivid picture. I could almost feel the cold rain, hear it pattering on leaves and drumming on the roof of a ranger truck. So I hustled it to the truck, got inside, and headed back to the ranger station where I planned to spend the rest of the evening, Harlan continued. And since it was a quiet night at the ranger station, it looked like I would get what I wanted. I was used to working the late shift by myself as the night supervisor, so being alone didn't bother me. I'd always been a quiet type who liked to read a book, so it was an ideal situation for me, except for that night. He took a deep breath before continuing, as if steeling himself for what came next. Because Halloween was over and the rain had been steady, the park hadn't received as many visitors as it usually had. But I was inside the ranger station, this ranger station, in fact, which was just as cozy and warm as you see it now. Plus, now that I was done with my task, I was free to read a book, so I wasted no time in curling up by the fire with a paperback. I looked around the station, trying to imagine it as it was 30 years ago. The basics would have been the same: the fireplace, the desk, the maps on the walls. But there would have been no computers, no cell phones, just a landline and a radio for emergencies. I'd spent many a shift this way, and it was fine by me, Harlan said. I'd happily read a book on a nice day, but on a rainy day, nothing better. Eventually I started to get hungry. Since I'd just brought a light snack but turned out to be craving something bigger, I decided to order pizza. There was a local joint that was only a few minutes away that often delivered out here back then, so I didn't hesitate to give them a call. I ordered a medium pizza with pepperoni, and as I hung up, the rain started to really pound heavily on the station roof. Harlan's voice took on a quieter tone, as if he was sharing a secret. I knew from experience that the rain pounding on the station roof could truly be loud. It seemed to surround you from all sides. I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. On rainy nights, the sound of water drumming on the roof could be almost deafening. But by the time the headlights pulled into the driveway, Harlan continued, the rain had faded to a slight drizzle. But I could see the grass leading up here was pretty well soaked, and there were numerous small puddles on both the grass and the road. The trees were swaying along with the winds, and the sky was getting darker by the minute as night was settling in. By now the outdoor lights had started to switch on as the car from the pizza place pulled up in front of the station, its windshield wipers going back and forth as it stopped in front of the entrance. Harlan's description was so detailed, I could almost see the scene unfolding before my eyes. The wet grass gleaming under the outdoor lights, the pizza delivery car with its wipers still swishing back and forth, the darkening sky above. I stood in front of it, under the part of the roof that kept me out of the rain, Harlan said. The driver, a young guy named Derek in his early 20s, got out of the driver's seat and grabbed the pizza from the passenger's side. Derek had delivered here before, and he'd always done a great job. We chit-chatted as I handed him the cash with a generous tip. Then Derek handed me the pizza and was just about to go back to his car before he stopped and stared at something behind me. Harlan paused, his eyes distant as if seeing that moment replayed before him. He paused and said that it would probably sound crazy, but it looked like there was a woman lurking in the woods near the ranger station. We all sat there silently for a moment, the weight of Harlan's words hanging in the air. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I saw Anthony and Craig shift uncomfortably in their seats. I remember just standing there when he told me, Harlan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The words sounded almost foreign as Derek said them out loud. My first reaction was that it was impossible, but there was only one way to find out, so I turned behind me to look at where he was pointing. He took another sip of his now cold coffee, as if needing a moment to collect himself before continuing. The cluster of trees he was pointing at was a dense area of tall pine trees. They'd been long gone by now. But back then there wasn't much in the way of illumination out there, but even I could see there was nothing there. I stood there, the pizza still clutched in my hand as I waited for anything to happen. But nothing emerged from the woods. Harlan's voice grew even quieter, forcing us to lean in to hear him. I was just about to turn back to Derek when I heard "Get out" from beside me in a hushed voice, clear as could be. I turned around immediately to look at Derek, and without saying a word I knew he'd heard it too. A chill ran through me as Harlan spoke those words. I could almost hear that ghostly whisper myself, carried on the night wind. But while it was creepy as could be, I didn't know for sure what it meant, Harlan continued. It didn't come out as an ominous command, more like a warning. But I won't lie, standing there outside, I'd never felt fear like that before. I'd been afraid before, and I'd been afraid after, but not like that. That fear was less like a feeling and more like a part of your body, like it's always there, and only rarely are you truly aware of it. As Harlan spoke, his eyes seemed to look beyond us, beyond the warm, cozy ranger station, back to that cold November night 30 years ago. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment those shadows seemed to take on sinister shapes. I couldn't have told you how much time passed, Harlan said, his voice distant. May have only been a minute or two, but despite the dwindling light I thought I could see shapes moving far out in the woods, very far out. After a moment you couldn't see anything at all. He paused, his brow furrowed, as if trying to make sense of a particularly puzzling memory. To this day I have no idea why that sight filled me with so much fear, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Just like I also have no idea how I knew it was people, but I did. And I knew it was people, as in more than one, much more than one, but I had no idea exactly how many. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. We were all leaning forward, hanging on Harlan's every word. The comfortable warmth of the ranger station seemed to have vanished, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Then, almost as if on cue, I heard the word "now," Harlan said, and it was all the motivation I needed to tell Derek we had to go. He didn't need to be told twice because we hopped in his car and got out of there as fast as we could. Didn't stop for about 20 miles and we were far away from the ranger station. He let out a small, humorless chuckle. By that point, the fear had slowly faded and I was starving, so we split the pizza while debating what to tell my superiors. I eventually decided to say that I was feeling really sick and went to see a doctor I knew. Harlan shook his head, a rueful smile on his face. But it didn't take long for me to realize my excuse for leaving would be completely forgotten, because after I left, the ranger station had been broken into by a group of people. My eyes widened at this revelation, and I saw similar looks of shock on Anthony and Craig's faces. We all knew about break-ins and vandalism in the park, but this felt different, more personal somehow. The security camera we had at the time saw all 6 of them, dressed from head to toe in black, break right through the front door, Harlan continued. Just crashed right through it. Then, minutes later, they came back out without taking anything and vanished into the trees. The cops thoroughly searched the area but found nothing. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. I found out when I called my superiors to tell them I had to leave because I was feeling horrible. From the time on the camera, they appeared to arrive within mere minutes after I left with Derek. We all exchanged looks as the full weight of what Harlan was saying sank in. This wasn't just a story about something that happened in the park. This had happened right here, in this very ranger station where we now sat. Harlan didn't say anything for a moment, but he could clearly see the effect his words were having on us. The ranger station, which had always felt like a safe haven, suddenly seemed different. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, the creaking of the old wood more ominous. The conclusion the cops reached, Harlan eventually said, breaking the tense silence, is that it was a gang of professional criminals who saw the ranger station and decided to see what they could find. Since there was apparently nothing they could make use of, they split. He paused, his eyes sweeping over each of us in turn. And every year on that day since that happened, I've taken a single flower and left it by where Derek says he saw someone that night. I've never seen or heard that voice since that night, but on occasion I've felt the presence of something or someone watching me, and not in an unpleasant way. Harlan's voice took on a thoughtful tone. But that's the thing about the woods. There's no telling what you may find in them, and if you're really paying attention, it's amazing what you can learn. Like I learned that November night all those years ago was a full moon. The clouds just happened to obscure it out here. As Harlan finished his story, a heavy silence fell over the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through the trees and creating eerie whispers that seemed to echo Harlan's tale. I found myself looking at the ranger station with new eyes. The comfortable, familiar space now held an air of mystery. Every creak of the old wood, every shadow in the corners, seemed to hold the potential for something more. Anthony was the first to break the silence. "Harlan," he said, his voice slightly shaky, Do you think it was really the witch from the story?" Harlan shook his head slowly. "I can't say for sure, Anthony. What I can say is that there are things in these woods that defy easy explanation, whether it's a witch or spirits, or just the wild nature of the forest itself. Who can say?" Craig leaned forward, his face pale in the firelight. "But the voice, the people in the woods, what do you think they were?" "I've asked myself that question 1,000 times over the years," Harlan replied. "Sometimes I think it was just my imagination, fueled by old stories and a dark, rainy night. Other times—" He trailed off, his eyes distant. "Other times I'm not so sure." I found myself speaking up, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Do you ever feel unsafe out here after what happened?" Harlan turned to me, a small smile on his weathered face. "No, not unsafe. Cautious, maybe, more aware. These woods, they're not good or evil. They just are. They have their own rules, their own way of being. Our job isn't to understand it all, but to respect it, to listen when the woods speak, even if we don't always understand what they're saying. He stood up, stretching his back. That's enough ghost stories for one night, I think. We've still got a job to do after all. As if on cue, the radio on the desk crackled to life, breaking the spell that had fallen over us. It was just a routine check-in from another ranger, but it served to remind us of the world beyond our fireside circle. We all stood up, shaking off the lingering effects of Harlan's story. But as I moved to check the monitors, I couldn't help but glance out the window into the dark woods beyond. For a moment I thought I saw something move among the trees, a flash of white, like a woman's dress. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there but shadows and leaves. I turned back to my tasks, but Harlan's words echoed in my mind. The woods have their own rules, their own way of being. And as I settled in for the rest of my shift, I found myself listening more closely to the whispers of the wind, the creaking of the trees, wondering what secrets they might hold. From that night on, every time I walked through the woods, every time I heard an unexplained sound or felt an unexpected chill, I remembered Harlan's story, and I remembered to listen, to pay attention, because out here, in the wild heart of the forest, you never know what you might learn, or what might be listening back. The sky was turning a dark gray as the train arrived at the small Norwich station. I stepped off the carriage, carrying my old leather suitcase that I had inherited from my grandfather. My name is Thomas Harrison, a journalist in my 30s, and I had come to Norfolk in search of a story that could change the course of my professional life. I had heard about the legend of Black Shuck, the mythical black dog said to roam the Norfolk countryside for centuries. At first I thought it was just a local myth, but after months of research I found an intriguing pattern in reports and testimonies. There was something happening here, something beyond mere folktales. I took an old taxi from the station to the village of Blacking, a small town on the edge of the lowlands. The driver, an old man named Harold, seemed reserved at first, but soon started chatting when I told him about the reason for my visit. "Ah, Black Shuck," Harold said, his eyes gleaming in the rearview mirror. "I've seen him myself many years ago. It was on a stormy night I was driving back from the Red Bull pub. Suddenly he appeared in the middle of the road. He was huge, the size of a small horse, and his eyes were glowing like embers. I asked him for more details, and Harold began to recount other stories he had heard over the years. Stories of lost travelers who found their way thanks to the appearance of the black dog, and others of tragic accidents preceded by the appearance of the mysterious creature. After an hour of driving through narrow country roads, we arrived at Blacking. The village was smaller than I expected, a collection of old stone houses surrounding a small central square. In the middle of the square was a small church with a stone tower that seemed to silently watch over the village. I got out of the taxi in front of the White Hart Inn, an old wooden building dating back to the 16th century. The innkeeper, Mrs. Edith Perkins, was a woman in her 60s with a friendly face and a neat appearance. "Welcome to Blacking, Mr. Harrison," she said as she took my suitcase. "I heard you're here to research Black Shuck. Well, I can tell you that you'll hear plenty of stories here." As I was checking in, I noticed an old photograph hanging on the wall behind the desk. The photo was faded and yellowed with age, but I could clearly see a large black shape standing next to the church in the center of the village. "Ah, I see you've noticed the photo," Mrs. Perkins said with a mysterious smile. "My grandfather took it in 1901. He always said it was the clearest picture of Black Shuck ever taken. Of course, most people think it's just a trick, but, well, we in Blacking know better." I went up to my room on the upper floor, a small but comfortable room with a window overlooking the village square. I sat on the bed and took out my notebook, thinking about my plan for the coming days. I knew there were many stories to uncover, many mysteries to solve. As the sun set, the village lights began to come on one by one. I looked out the window at the growing shadows in the square, wondering if Black Shuck was also watching from somewhere in the darkness. I didn't know then that the coming days would radically change my understanding of the world, and that I would face things that challenged everything I thought was real. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of church bells. The clock showed 7 in the morning, and the sun was casting its first rays on the village square. After a quick breakfast prepared by Mrs. Perkins, I decided to start my day with a visit to the village library. The library was a small building next to the church, run by an old man named Arthur Wilkinson. When I entered, I found him sitting behind an old desk, surrounded by piles of books and documents. "Ah, you're the journalist looking for Black Shuck, aren't you?" Arthur said with a broad smile. "Well, you've come to the right place. We have records here dating back to the 16th century. I spent the next few hours diving into old records, reading about strange incidents and mysterious appearances of the black dog. There was a clear pattern. Over the centuries, Black Shuck appeared in times of crisis and major changes. One of the records that particularly caught my attention was the diary of Reverend Thomas Bradley, who was the church's pastor in the late 18th century. Bradley wrote about a personal encounter with Black Shuck. On the night of August 15, 1784, as I was returning from visiting a patient on the outskirts of the village, I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the road, huge and black as night itself. His eyes were glowing a deep red. I felt fear overtake me, but I remembered my duty as a man of God. I raised the cross I was carrying and prayed. And then something strange happened. Instead of attacking me or fleeing, the dog bowed its head, as if greeting me, then disappeared into the darkness. The next day, we discovered that the river had overflowed and flooded a large part of the fields. Had it not been for Black Shuck's warning, I would have taken that path and surely drowned. This account greatly intrigued me. It contradicted the stereotypical image of the black dog as an omen of doom, and instead presented a picture of a protective being. When I left the library, the sun had begun to set. I decided to walk around the village, trying to absorb everything I had read. As I was walking by the church, I noticed something strange on one of the old stone walls. There was an ancient inscription, almost invisible due to the erosion of the stone. But when I looked closely, I could clearly see the shape of a large dog carved into the stone. And beneath it, there were words in Latin, "Custos vigilat in tenebris," the guardian watches in the darkness. I returned to the inn feeling excited and puzzled at the same time. I knew I had begun to scratch the surface of a deep mystery, a mystery whose roots stretched across centuries of history. That night, I sat in my room writing my notes, trying to connect everything I had discovered. While I was engrossed in writing, I heard a strange sound coming from outside the window. It was a low sound, like a growl, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I got up and went to the window, staring into the darkness. I didn't see anything, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. Was that just an illusion, or was Black Shuck watching me? With the dawn of the third day, I decided to explore the areas surrounding the village. The weather was cold and damp, and fog covered the neighboring fields. I started my journey on foot, heading towards the nearby forest that was the focus of many Black Shuck stories. After an hour of walking, I reached the edge of the forest. The trees were dense and old, and it seemed as if light itself hesitated to penetrate their shadows. I entered the forest cautiously, listening to the sound of my feet on the dry leaves and the creaking of branches above me. Suddenly, I heard the sound of movement in a nearby thicket. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. There was something moving among the trees, something big. Was this Black Shuck? But what appeared was surprising in a completely different way. It was an old man, wearing a worn coat and carrying a wooden stick. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, his pale blue eyes staring at me curiously. "Hello, stranger," the man said in a hoarse voice. "What brings you to this old forest?" I introduced myself and explained why I was there. When I mentioned Black Shuck, his eyes glinted in a strange way. "Ah, the old guardian," the man whispered. "He's been here for a long time, longer than any human can remember. My name is Aldrich, and Well, let's say I know this forest well. Aldrich began to tell stories about Black Shuck, stories I had never heard before. He spoke of how the black dog was originally a guardian of the boundaries between our world and another world, a world of magic and myths. But over time, Aldrich said, people forgot. They forgot the magic, forgot the old secrets, and now Black Shuck protects those who still believe, those who can still see beyond the veil of reality. I spent hours talking with Aldrich, listening to his amazing stories. When the sun began to set, I realized I needed to return to the village. "Be careful, young journalist," Aldrich said as he bid me farewell. "Knowledge is power, but it's also dangerous. And remember, in this forest, not everything is as it seems." I returned to the village with my mind spinning from everything I had heard. Was Aldrich telling the truth, or was he just an old man who liked to tell fantastical stories? That night I woke up to the sound of a deep bark coming from outside the inn. I rushed to the window, but the square was empty. However, there was something different. On the doorstep of the inn, there was something gleaming in the moonlight. When I went down to examine it in the morning, I discovered it was a strange black stone, warm to the touch despite the cold night. With the beginning of my 4th day in Blacking, I decided to talk to more village residents. I felt there were more stories and secrets that had not yet been revealed. I started by visiting the local blacksmith, a large man named George Smith. His workshop was full of old tools and wrought iron. When I asked him about Black Shuck, he stopped working and looked at me seriously. "I saw him once," George said in a low voice. "It was 10 years ago, on a stormy night. I was coming back from the pub when I saw him standing in the middle of the road. He was huge, bigger than any dog I've ever seen. But the strange thing is, I didn't feel afraid. Instead, I felt safe." George told me that on that night when he returned home, he found that the roof of his house had collapsed due to the storm. If he hadn't been delayed by seeing Black Shuck, he would have been under that roof when it collapsed. Next, I visited the local school where I met the teacher, Mrs. Eileen Grant. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a warm smile. "Yes, we teach the children about Black Shuck," Eileen said, "but we don't present him as a frightening monster. For us, he's part of our heritage, a symbol of protection for the village." Eileen told me about an art project the students did last year, where they drew pictures of Black Shuck. She showed me some of the drawings, and it was fascinating to see how the children depicted the black dog. In some drawings he looked scary, but in most he was portrayed as a friendly guardian. As evening approached, I decided to visit the local pub, the Red Bull. The place was crowded, full of locals who had come to relax after a long day of work. I sat at the bar and ordered a drink. Next to me was an old hunter named Frank. When he learned I was looking for stories about Black Shuck, he smiled broadly. "Well, lad, I've got a story for you," Frank said. "About 20 years ago, I was hunting in the forest when I lost my way. Night fell and I started to feel desperate. Then suddenly this huge black dog appeared. He didn't come close to me, but he started walking in front of me. I followed him, and before I knew it, I was out of the forest and on the road leading to the village." As the night progressed, I heard more and more stories. Some were scary, others were amazing. But in every story, there was a common element. Black Shuck was always present in moments of crisis, either to warn or to help. When I returned to the inn late at night, my head was spinning with everything I had heard. I sat on my bed trying to organize my thoughts. There was a pattern forming, but I couldn't quite define it. Suddenly I heard a soft knock on my room door. When I opened the door, there was no one there, but on the floor there was an old folded paper. When I opened it, I found a message written in old handwriting. "If you want to know the truth about the Guardian, meet me at the old well at midnight tomorrow. A friend." I looked at the clock. I had less than 24 hours until the mysterious appointment. I felt excitement and fear mixing inside me. I knew I was about to discover something big, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. I spent most of the next day in a state of tension and anticipation. I tried to keep myself busy by reviewing my notes and conducting more interviews with villagers, but my mind was always returning to the mysterious message and the midnight appointment. As midnight approached, I snuck out of the inn. The night was cold and the sky was clear, the moon casting its pale light on the sleeping village. The old well was located on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by ancient trees that looked like silent guardians. When I arrived at the well, there was no one there. I sat on the edge of the well, listening to the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Then I heard the sound of soft footsteps approaching. From among the shadows, a familiar figure appeared. It was Mrs. Perkins, the innkeeper. But she looked different now, more dignified and mysterious. "Hello, Thomas," she said in a calm voice. "I apologize for the secrecy, but what I'm about to tell you now cannot be heard in the light of day." Mrs. Perkins began to speak, and her words radically changed my understanding of the world. She told me that she was part of a secret group, guardians who had been protecting the secret of Black Shuck for generations. "Black Shuck is not just a legend," she said. "He's an ancient being, a guardian of the boundaries between our world and other worlds. He's been here for thousands of years, protecting humans from forces they cannot understand." She told me that Blacking was a point of intersection between worlds, a place where the veil between reality and fantasy was thin, and that Black Shuck was the guardian who prevented dangerous forces from crossing this veil. "But why are you telling me all this?" I asked, stunned by what I was hearing. "Because we need your help," she answered. "The veil is weakening, and the forces trying to cross are growing stronger. We need someone who can spread the story, not as a myth, but as a warning. We need someone who can awaken the old faith in people." Suddenly we heard a deep bark coming from the nearby forest. I looked at Mrs. Perkins, who seemed very tense. "He's here," she whispered. "Black Shuck." From among the trees a huge black shape appeared. It was bigger than any dog I had ever seen in my life, almost the size of a small horse. His eyes were glowing a deep red, and his fur seemed to absorb the light around him. I felt fear overtake me, but Mrs. Perkins put her hand on my shoulder reassuringly. "Don't be afraid," she said. "He's here to help us." Black Shuck slowly advanced towards us. As he approached, I felt a wave of energy emanating from him. It wasn't frightening energy, but strong and protective. "Thomas," Mrs. Perkins said in a serious voice, "what you're about to see now will change your life forever. Are you ready?" I nodded, unable to speak. Mrs. Perkins pulled out a strange necklace from under her clothes. It held a black stone similar to the one I had found on the doorstep of the inn. "This is the Guardian Stone," she explained. "It allows us to see the world as Black Shuck sees it." She placed the stone in my hand, and suddenly everything changed. The world around me seemed to ripple and change. I saw threads of light connecting everything, the trees, the ground, even the air itself. And in the midst of all this, Black Shuck was glowing with a strong light. "What is this?" I asked, amazed. "This is the truth," Mrs. Perkins answered. "This is the world as it really is. All those threads are links between our world and other worlds, and Black Shuck is the guardian who maintains the balance of these links." Suddenly I saw something moving in the shadows. It was a dark shape, moving in an unnatural way. I felt terror overtake me when I realized that this thing was trying to penetrate one of the links. Black Shuck moved with amazing speed. He pounced on the shadowy figure, and I watched a strange battle unfold before my eyes. It was like a dance of light and darkness, moving faster than my eyes could follow, and after what seemed like an eternity, the battle ended. The shadowy figure disappeared, and Black Shuck returned to us, looking tired but victorious. "This is what happens every night," Mrs. Perkins said. "Black Shuck protects us from things we can't even imagine, but the battles are getting harder, and the enemies are growing stronger." I returned the stone to her, and the world returned to its familiar nature, but I felt that I would never look at it the same way again. "Why me?" I finally asked. "Why did you choose me to see all this?" Mrs. Perkins smiled a sad smile. "Because we need your help, Thomas. We need someone who can tell the world about Black Shuck, not as a legend, but as a truth. We need someone who can awaken the old faith in people, because without this faith, Black Shuck's power weakens and the veil between worlds becomes more fragile. I looked at Black Shuck, who was looking at me with his deep red eyes. I felt as if he was reading my soul, testing my readiness for this task. "And what if I refuse?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "Then we'll erase your memories of this night," Mrs. Perkins answered firmly, "and you'll return to your previous life, believing that all this was just a strange dream." I looked again at Black Shuck, then at Mrs. Perkins. I knew that my decision would change my life forever, but I also knew that I couldn't return to my old life after everything I had seen. "I agree," I finally said. "I'll help you. I'll tell the world about Black Shuck." Mrs. Perkins smiled, and Black Shuck seemed to nod his head in silent approval. "All right then," Mrs. Perkins said. "Let's begin your training. You have a lot to learn, and we don't have much time." And so began my true journey, a journey that would take me into the depths of ancient secrets and put me face to face with forces beyond imagination. But I knew I wasn't alone. I now had a powerful ally, the legendary black dog, Black Shuck. The following weeks were the most exciting and exhausting of my life. Under the guidance of Mrs. Perkins and other members of the Border Guards, as they called themselves, I began to learn the secrets of a world I had been unaware of until recently. I learned how to use the Guardian Stone to see the links between worlds. I learned about the history of Black Shuck and how it was intertwined with human history itself. I discovered that there were many black dogs around the world, each protecting a specific area. But the most important lesson was learning how to communicate with Black Shuck himself. It wasn't easy. He didn't speak in words as we do. Instead, he communicated through images, feelings, and sensations. One night, while I was practicing communicating with him in the forest, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a wave of memories. But they weren't my memories. They were Black Shuck's own memories. I saw images from ancient times, civilizations forgotten by history, and creatures that had not yet set foot on Earth. I saw Black Shuck fighting monsters from nightmares, protecting the early humans from unimaginable dangers. When the vision ended, I found myself sitting on the ground, breathing heavily. I looked at Black Shuck, who was looking at me with his deep eyes. "Why did you show me all this?" I asked him in my mind. The answer came in the form of a strong feeling, a sense of responsibility and duty. I understood that Black Shuck was trying to show me the importance of our mission and how our existence was necessary for the continuation of life as we know it. As time passed, I became more proficient in using my new abilities. I learned how to see the subtle signs that indicated abnormal activity and how to help Black Shuck in repelling small threats. But all of this was just preparation for what was coming. One night, I woke up to the urgent barking of Black Shuck. When I looked out of my window in the inn, I saw the sky glowing with a strange red color. I rushed outside, where I found Mrs. Perkins and the rest of the guards gathering. "It has begun," Mrs. Perkins said in a grave voice. "The big attack we've been fearing. The veil is tearing, and we have to stop it before it's too late." I looked at Black Shuck, who was standing beside me. I felt his determination and strength flowing through my veins. I knew that this moment was what I had been training for. "What do we need to do?" I asked, ready to face anything. "We need to go to the center of the storm," Mrs. Perkins answered, "to the place where the veil is thinnest, and there we'll fight a battle for the future of our world." And so we began our journey into the unknown, unsure of what we would face, but determined to protect our world at any cost. Black Shuck was leading the way, and I was walking beside him, ready to face whatever might come our way. I didn't know what awaited us, but I knew one thing. This night would determine the fate of our world, and I was determined to be part of saving it. Led by Black Shuck, we set off through the dark forest. The air was heavy with strange energy, and the sky glowed with colors I had never seen before. It felt as if the world itself was breathing, pulsing with an eerie, frightening rhythm. After an hour of walking, we reached the edge of a small lake. Its waters were black as ink, reflecting the strange colors in the sky. And in the center of the lake I saw something that made my heart stop for a moment. There was a huge vortex of light, slowly rotating and pulsing with power. "This is the center," Mrs. Perkins whispered, "the place where the veil between worlds is tearing." Suddenly, the ground began to shake beneath our feet. From the vortex, strange shapes began to appear, creatures from nightmares, ghosts and shadows moving in unnatural ways. Black Shuck let out a powerful bark, and I felt a wave of energy emanate from him. The other guardians spread out around the lake, each holding their guardian stones. I gripped mine tightly, feeling its warmth pulsing in sync with my racing heart. "Remember your training, Thomas," Mrs. Perkins said, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. "Focus on the links, strengthen them, don't let the darkness break through." I closed my eyes and concentrated on the guardian stone. When I opened them again, I could see the world as I had that first night. Threads of light connecting everything, now vibrating violently as the creatures from the vortex tried to break through. Black Shuck charged forward, his form seeming to grow larger, more majestic. He engaged the nightmarish creatures, his teeth and claws glowing with an otherworldly light. The other guardians raised their stones, streams of energy flowing from them to reinforce the weakening barriers. I focused all my will on the stone in my hand, picturing the threads of light growing stronger, pushing back against the invading darkness. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, every fiber of my being straining against forces I could barely comprehend. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The sky above us churned with unnatural colors, the very fabric of reality seeming to warp and twist. Black Shuck fought tirelessly, his spectral form darting between dimensions as he drove back creature after creature. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, when the strain of channeling so much energy felt like it would tear me apart, I heard a sound that cut through the chaos, the deep resonant toll of a bell. I looked toward the village and saw an incredible sight. The old church tower was glowing with a soft golden light. As the bell continued to ring, I saw threads of that same light stretching out from the tower, intertwining with the energy from our guardian stones. "The old faith," Mrs. Perkins gasped, her face alight with joy and wonder. "The villagers, they're believing again." With this new surge of power, we redoubled our efforts. Black Shuck let out a howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The vortex in the lake began to shrink, the nightmarish creatures being pulled back into it. With a final thunderous crash, the vortex collapsed in on itself. The strange lights in the sky faded and the oppressive energy that had filled the air dissipated. We had done it. We had closed the breach. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I looked around at my fellow guardians. We were exhausted, drained in ways I couldn't even describe, but alive. Black Shuck padded over to me, his red eyes now soft and warm. I reached out and for the first time felt his fur under my hand. It was like touching living shadow, cool and comforting. "It's not over, you know," Mrs. Perkins said, coming to stand beside me. "There will always be threats, always be those who seek to breach the veil. But now, thanks to you, we're stronger than ever." I nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility I had taken on. "So what happens now?" I asked. Mrs. Perkins smiled. "Now, Thomas Harrison, you have a story to tell. A true story, one that will awaken the old faith in people far beyond our little village. Are you ready for that?" I looked at Black Shuck, at the other guardians, at the village in the distance where ordinary people had just played a part in saving the world without even knowing it. I thought of all I had learned, all I had experienced, and I knew there was only one answer I could give. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." As we walked back to the village, the sun rising behind us, I began to think about how I would tell this story. It would be a tale of mystery and magic, of ancient guardians and modern faith, a story of a journalist who came looking for a legend and found a reality beyond his wildest imagination. But most of all, it would be the story of Black Shuck, the guardian in the shadows, the protector at the edge of reality. And as long as there were those who believed, who remembered the old tales and respected the ancient ways, he would always be there, watching over us all. It all started with a simple text message from my friend, Matt. "Hey, we're planning a trip to my cousin's cabin next weekend. You in?" I stared at my phone, a mix of excitement and disappointment washing over me. The idea of escaping the city for a weekend in the wilderness was incredibly appealing, but I knew immediately that my work schedule would make it impossible to join them on their planned departure date. "Sorry, can't make it that day. Work's got me tied up," I typed back, feeling a pang of regret. Matt's response came quickly. "No worries, man. Why don't you join us a day later? The cabin's big enough and we'll save you a bunk." I hesitated for a moment. The thought of making the journey alone was a bit daunting, but the prospect of missing out entirely was even worse. "You know what? I'm in. I'll head up the next day," I replied, already feeling a surge of anticipation. As Matt filled me in on the details, I realized this wasn't going to be your typical cabin getaway. The place was seriously remote, no roads leading to it, accessible only by a challenging hiking trail that would take the better part of a day to traverse. The isolation appealed to me, a chance to truly disconnect from the world and recharge. "One thing though," Matt added, "the last part of the trail is pretty treacherous, especially if you don't know it. You'll probably have to camp overnight before tackling that section." I paused, considering this new information. Camping alone wasn't something I'd done before, but the idea intrigued me. It would be an adventure, a chance to prove something to myself. "No problem," I responded, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm up for the challenge." As I ended the conversation with Matt and started to plan for the trip, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, a mix of excitement and apprehension. Little did I know this solo camping experience would turn out to be far more than the simple adventure I was anticipating. The week leading up to the trip flew by in a flurry of preparation. I threw myself into researching solo camping tips, watching countless YouTube videos, and reading through wilderness survival guides. Despite never having camped alone before, I was determined to be as prepared as possible. I made multiple trips to the outdoor supply store, each visit adding to my growing collection of gear. A compact one-person tent, a state-of-the-art sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a portable stove, water purification tablets. My list seemed endless. The salesperson, a grizzled old man with a beard that would make a lumberjack jealous, eyed me with a mixture of amusement and concern. "First time soloing, eh?" he asked as I piled my items on the counter. I nodded, trying not to let my nervousness show. "Is it that obvious?" He chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from his very core. "You've got that look about you, excited but scared shitless." I couldn't help but laugh. He'd nailed it perfectly. The old man leaned in, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "Listen, kid, the wilderness, she's beautiful, but she can be cruel. Respect her and you'll be fine. But never ever let your guard down. Got it?" I nodded solemnly, his words sending a shiver down my spine. As I left the store, my arms laden with bags, his warning echoed in my mind. Little did I know how prophetic those words would prove to be. The night before my departure, I meticulously packed and repacked my backpack, checking and double-checking my supplies. Maps, compass, first aid kit, extra batteries for my flashlight, everything found its designated spot. As I zipped up the pack, a sense of accomplishment washed over me. I was ready, or so I thought. The morning of my departure dawned crisp and clear, a perfect autumn day. I loaded my gear into my car and set off, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. As I drove further from the city, the landscape gradually transformed. Concrete and steel gave way to rolling hills and dense forests, the fall foliage a riot of reds, oranges, and yellows. I arrived at the trailhead parking lot just as the sun reached its zenith. A few other cars were scattered about, likely belonging to my friends who had set out the day before. I shouldered my pack, its weight a reminder of the journey ahead, and took my first steps onto the trail. The initial part of the hike was relatively easy, a well-maintained path winding through sun-dappled woods. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine. As I walked, I felt the stresses of city life melting away, replaced by a growing sense of peace and connection with nature. However, as the hours wore on and the trail became more challenging, that peace was gradually replaced by physical exertion. The path grew steeper, riddled with rocks and tree roots that threatened to trip me at every step. My pack, which had felt manageable at first, now seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. By late afternoon I was exhausted but exhilarated. I had covered a good distance, but I knew I still had a long way to go. As the shadows lengthened and the light began to fade, I started to look for a suitable campsite. The old man's words from the store came back to me: respect the wilderness and never let your guard down. Just as I was beginning to worry that I'd have to set up camp in less than ideal conditions, I stumbled upon a small clearing. It was perfect, about 40 feet across, relatively flat, with a natural boundary of dense trees surrounding it. A sense of relief washed over me. This would be home for the night. As I began to set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, peering into the deepening gloom of the forest, but each time I saw nothing but trees and shadows. I told myself it was just nerves, the natural apprehension of being alone in the wilderness for the first time. Still, a nagging sense of unease persisted, a feeling that this night might hold more than I had bargained for. With my tent pitched and secured, I set about gathering wood for a fire. The process was therapeutic, the repetitive motion of collecting and arranging the kindling and larger logs helping to calm my nerves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, I finally got the fire going. The warmth and light of the flames were comforting, pushing back the encroaching darkness and creating a cozy circle of illumination. I sat back, feeling a sense of accomplishment. I had made it this far, set up camp, and started a fire all on my own. Maybe this solo camping thing wasn't so daunting after all. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I busied myself with dinner preparations. I pulled out the pack of hot dogs I'd brought along, finding a suitable stick to use as a makeshift roasting spit. The sizzle and pop of the hot dogs over the fire, combined with the crackling of the flames, created a soothing soundtrack to the evening. After dinner, I treated myself to the quintessential camping dessert, s'mores. The combination of gooey marshmallow, melted chocolate, and crisp graham cracker was heavenly, and for a moment all my earlier anxieties melted away like the chocolate on my tongue. As I sat there, basking in the fire's glow and enjoying the peaceful solitude, I began to reflect on the day's journey. The physical challenge had been invigorating, pushing me out of my comfort zone and showing me what I was capable of. There was something profoundly satisfying about relying solely on myself, carrying everything I needed on my back. However, as the night wore on, that sense of peaceful solitude began to shift into something less comfortable. The darkness beyond the fire's reach seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive. The sounds of the forest, which had been a pleasant backdrop during the day, now took on a more ominous tone. It started with small noises, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs. At first I dismissed them as the natural sounds of the woods at night. But as time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that these sounds had a pattern to them. It was as if something was moving around the clearing, circling just beyond the reach of the firelight. I tried to rationalize it. The woods were full of nocturnal animals, after all. It was probably just a curious fox or raccoon, drawn by the scent of my dinner. But as the circling continued, making 4 or 5 complete revolutions around the clearing, my unease grew. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, I decided to investigate. As soon as I stood up, the noises ceased abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could have sworn I heard something larger moving quickly away through the underbrush. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, straining my ears for any further sounds. But the woods had gone eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Shaking off the lingering sense of unease, I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. I was alone in the woods for the first time. Of course, I was a bit jumpy. Deciding it was time to turn in for the night, I carefully extinguished the fire, making sure every ember was out. As darkness engulfed the clearing, I retreated to my tent, zipping myself securely inside. Despite my earlier scare, exhaustion soon overtook me, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep, unaware that the night's events were far from over. I'm not sure how long I slept before the whispers began. At first they insinuated themselves into my dreams, a barely audible murmur that I couldn't quite make out. Gradually, as I hovered in that liminal space between sleep and wakefulness, I became aware that the whispers were real, coming from just outside my tent. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding in my chest. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as I strained my ears to make sense of what I was hearing. The voice, or voices, I couldn't be sure, were just above a whisper, the words indistinct and muffled. For a wild moment I wondered if it could be my friends, having perhaps decided to come looking for me. But no, that made no sense. They were miles away at the cabin, and in any case, why would they be whispering outside my tent in the middle of the night? As I listened, I realized I couldn't understand what was being said. It didn't sound like English or any language I recognized. The syllables were strange, almost guttural, with an odd rhythmic quality that sent shivers down my spine. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in fear, listening to those impossible whispers. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the face of this inexplicable phenomenon. Just as I was starting to wonder if I was losing my mind, if this was all some vivid hallucination brought on by the stress of camping alone, something happened that proved all too real. A hand, or something like a hand, pressed against the side of my tent, down near my feet. In the faint moonlight filtering through the tent fabric, I could see the clear impression of fingers, pressing insistently against the nylon. Panic surged through me, jolting me into action. I sat up quickly, a strangled cry escaping my lips. The reaction was instantaneous. Whatever was outside my tent took off at a sprint, crashing through the underbrush with a speed that seemed impossible for the dense forest surrounding my campsite. For a long moment, I sat there in the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind reeling from what had just happened. When I finally gathered the courage to unzip the tent and peer outside, flashlight in hand, the clearing was empty. The beam of light revealed nothing but trees and shadows, no sign of whatever had been out there moments before. With shaking hands, I examined the spot where the hand had pressed against the tent. I half expected to find a muddy print or some other tangible evidence of the encounter. But there was nothing. The fabric was clean and undisturbed. Sleep was out of the question after that. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my sleeping bag, flashlight clutched in my hand, jumping at every sound. As the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I had never been so glad to see the sun. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I broke camp with a speed born of desperation. My hands shook as I packed up my gear, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the surrounding woods. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't bother with breakfast, couldn't even stomach the thought of food. All I wanted was to get out of there, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had visited my camp in the night. The hike that day was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. The trail, which should have become easier as it approached the cabin, seemed to grow more challenging with each step. Or maybe it was just my frayed nerves and lack of sleep making everything more difficult. I pushed myself hard, barely stopping for rest or water. The events of the night played on a loop in my mind, the whispers, the hand on the tent, the impossible speed of whatever had fled into the woods. None of it made sense, and yet I couldn't deny what I'd experienced. As I hiked, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Could it have been some kind of animal? But what animal whispers in an unknown language? A person, then? But who would be out there in the middle of nowhere, and why would they flee like that? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming yesterday, now felt oppressive and alien. Every shadow held potential threats. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. I found myself constantly looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from the trees behind me. It was late afternoon by the time I finally caught sight of the cabin. The wave of relief that washed over me was so intense it nearly brought me to my knees. I stumbled the last few hundred yards, my legs weak with exhaustion and residual fear. As I approached, I could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from the cabin. The normality of it was jarring after the surreal experience of the night before. For a moment, I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, suddenly unsure of how to explain what had happened, or if I even should. But then the door opened, and Matt stepped out onto the porch. The look of concern on his face when he saw me told me I must have looked as bad as I felt. "Hey, man, we were starting to worry about you. Are you okay?" he called out, jogging over to meet me. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him everything that had happened, but looking at his worried face, at the cozy cabin behind him filled with our friends, I faltered. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? "Yeah, I'm fine," I heard myself say. "Just a rough night camping. I'm glad to be here." Matt clapped me on the shoulder, steering me towards the cabin. "Well, you're here now. Come on in, get some food in you. You look like you could use it." As we walked towards the warmth and light of the cabin, I glanced back one last time at the dark line of trees behind me. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, a flicker of motion just at the edge of my vision. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Shaking my head, I turned back to the cabin. Whatever had happened out there in the woods, whatever I had encountered, it was behind me now. At least, that's what I told myself as I stepped over the threshold, leaving the wilderness and its mysteries behind. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they rang hollow. The whispers I'd heard, the touch on my tent, those weren't ordinary forest noises. They were something else entirely, something I couldn't explain or rationalize away. Matt steered me towards the kitchen area, pressing a cold beer into my hand. "Here, you look like you could use this. Dinner's almost ready. Lisa's famous chili. It'll warm you right up." I nodded gratefully, taking a long swig of the beer. The familiar taste helped ground me, reminding me that I was safe now, surrounded by friends. As I sank into one of the chairs at the kitchen table, I felt some of the tension begin to leave my body. Lisa, Matt's girlfriend and our designated chef for the trip, ladled out a generous portion of chili into a bowl and set it in front of me. The spicy aroma made my stomach growl, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since the previous night's campfire hot dogs. As I ate, my friends chatted around me, filling me in on their hike up to the cabin and the adventures they'd had while waiting for me to arrive. I tried to engage, to lose myself in their stories and laughter, but my mind kept drifting back to the clearing and the unsettling events of the night. "So, how was your solo camping experience?" Tom asked, his tone light and curious. "Think you'll do it again?" I froze for a moment, my spoon halfway to my mouth. How could I answer that? The truth was, the thought of camping alone again filled me with dread, but I couldn't explain why without sounding crazy. "It was interesting," I finally said, choosing my words carefully. "Definitely a learning experience." Tom nodded, seemingly satisfied with my vague answer, but I caught Sarah giving me a quizzical look, her brow furrowed slightly. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it, and turned back to her conversation with Lisa. As the evening wore on, I found myself relaxing slightly. The warmth of the cabin, the good food, and the companionship of my friends began to push the memories of the previous night to the back of my mind. but they didn't disappear entirely. Every now and then a sudden noise from outside, a branch scraping against the window, the hoot of an owl, would make me jump, my heart racing as I half expected to hear those eerie whispers again. When it came time for bed, I felt a surge of relief. The cabin had 4 small bedrooms, each with bunk beds. I was sharing with Matt, and the thought of not being alone as I slept was immensely comforting. As I lay in the bottom bunk, listening to Matt's steady breathing above me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Should I tell someone about what had happened? Would they even believe me if I did? And if it was real, what exactly had I encountered out there in the woods? Sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally did, it was filled with unsettling dreams of shadowy figures and whispered words in an unknown tongue. I woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of muffled conversation from the main room. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, I felt a surge of panic. Then I remembered where I was, safe in the cabin, surrounded by friends. As I made my way to the kitchen, I found most of the group already up and about. Lisa was at the stove flipping pancakes while others nursed mugs of coffee around the table. "Morning, sleepyhead," Matt greeted me cheerfully. "We were starting to wonder if you were going to sleep all day." I mumbled a greeting, gratefully accepting the mug of coffee Sarah held out to me. As I sipped the hot, bitter liquid, I felt some of the fog in my brain begin to clear. "So, what's the plan for today?" I asked, hoping to divert attention from my late appearance and disheveled state. "We were thinking of hiking up to the ridge," Tom said, spreading a map out on the table. "There's supposed to be an amazing view of the valley from up there." The others nodded enthusiastically, but I felt a knot form in my stomach. The thought of going back into those woods filled me with dread, but how could I explain my reluctance without revealing what had happened? "Sounds great," I heard myself say, even as my mind screamed in protest. As we geared up for the hike, I couldn't shake my unease. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig made me flinch. I tried to tell myself it was just leftover nerves from my solo camping experience, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The hike itself was beautiful. The autumn colors were in full display, the trees a riot of reds, golds, and oranges. Under different circumstances, I would have been in awe of the natural beauty surrounding us. But I couldn't relax, couldn't lose myself in the experience. I kept finding myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for what? I wasn't even sure. We reached the ridge around midday. The view was indeed spectacular. The valley spread out below us like a patchwork quilt of forest and meadow. As my friends oohed and awed, taking photos and pointing out landmarks, I stood slightly apart, my eyes drawn to the dense forest we had just traversed. "Hey, you okay?" Sarah's voice startled me out of my reverie. She had approached quietly, her face etched with concern. I turned to her, ready to brush off her question with another vague reassurance, but something in her expression stopped me. She looked genuinely worried, and for a moment I was tempted to confide in her, to share the burden of what I had experienced. I began, then hesitated. How could I even begin to explain? "I just had a weird experience while camping. It's probably nothing, but—" Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and she leaned in closer. "What kind of weird experience?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a shout from Tom interrupted us. "Hey guys, check this out!" We turned to see Tom pointing excitedly at something on the ground. As we gathered around, I saw what had caught his attention, a set of strange, elongated footprints in a patch of soft earth. "What do you think made these?" Lisa asked, her voice hushed with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. I stared at the prints, a chill running down my spine. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, too long and narrow to be human, but not matching any animal tracks I was familiar with. As the others speculated and debated, I remained silent, my mind racing. Could these tracks be connected to what I had experienced in the clearing? And if so, what exactly were we dealing with out here in these remote woods? The discovery of the tracks cast a somber mood over the group, as we began our descent back to the cabin. The carefree atmosphere of the morning hike was gone, replaced by a tense vigilance. Even those who had dismissed the tracks as nothing unusual seemed affected by the change in atmosphere. As we walked, I found myself falling into step beside Sarah. She glanced at me, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "So," she said quietly, ensuring the others couldn't overhear, "what were you going to tell me before, about your weird experience?" I hesitated, weighing my options. Part of me desperately wanted to share what had happened, to have someone else validate my experience. But another part feared being dismissed, or worse, thought crazy. "It's complicated," I finally said. "I'm not even sure what happened, to be honest." Sarah nodded slowly. "Sometimes talking about it can help, you know, even if you can't explain it." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Okay," I said, "but not here. Back at the cabin, maybe?" She agreed, and we continued our hike in silence. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful yesterday, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every shadow held potential dangers. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. As we filed inside, I caught Sarah's eye. She nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent agreement to our earlier conversation. As the others busied themselves with dinner preparations and reliving the day's hike, Sarah and I slipped out onto the cabin's small back porch. The woods loomed dark and silent beyond the small circle of light cast by the porch lamp. "All right," Sarah said, turning to face me. "What happened out there?" And so, with the forest as our witness, I began to recount my experience in the clearing. As I spoke, giving voice to the fear and confusion I had been carrying, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. Whatever had happened out there in the woods, I was no longer facing it alone. As I finished recounting my experience, Sarah stood silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the porch. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and thoughtful. "You know, my grandmother used to tell stories about these woods," she said, still not looking at me. "Old stories, passed down through generations. I always thought they were just fairy tales, meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the forest." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. "What kind of stories?" Sarah turned to face me, her expression serious. "Stories about the forest folk, creatures that weren't quite human, that lived deep in the woods where people rarely ventured. They were said to be curious about humans, but also dangerous if crossed." I stared at her, my mind racing. Could there be some truth to these old stories? Could they explain what I had encountered? "Did these stories mention anything about the forest folk? Whispering? Or moving incredibly fast?" I asked, hardly daring to breathe as I waited for her answer. Sarah nodded slowly. "The whispers were said to be how they communicated with each other. And yes, they were supposed to be incredibly quick and agile in the forest, able to disappear in the blink of an eye." A shiver ran down my spine. The parallels to my experience were uncanny, but surely these were just stories, myths born from the human tendency to create explanations for the unknown. "But that's impossible," I said, more to convince myself than anything else. "These are just old tales, right? There has to be a rational explanation for what happened." Sarah shrugged, her gaze drifting back to the forest. "Maybe. But think about those tracks we found today. They didn't look like anything we could explain, did they?" I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it again. She had a point. Those tracks had been unlike anything I'd ever seen before. "So what do we do?" I asked, feeling suddenly very small and vulnerable in the face of the vast unknown forest. "We be careful," Sarah said firmly. "We stick together, we don't go into the woods alone, and we keep our eyes open. And maybe we do some research when we get back to civilization. See if there are any other stories or reports of strange encounters in these woods." I nodded, grateful for her practical approach. It made the whole situation feel a little less overwhelming, a little more manageable. As we stood there on the porch, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted out from the cabin behind us. Our friends, oblivious to the potential danger lurking in the woods, were going about their evening as usual. "Should we tell the others?" I asked, torn between the desire to warn them and the fear of being dismissed or ridiculed. Sarah considered for a moment. "Not yet," she said finally. "Let's wait and see if anything else happens. For now, we'll just keep a close eye on things." As we turned to go back inside, a sudden movement at the edge of the forest caught my eye. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing there watching us. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing but shadows and trees. "Did you see that?" I whispered urgently to Sarah. She squinted into the darkness, then shook her head. "No. What was it?" I described what I thought I'd seen, my heart racing. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It could have been a deer," she said, but her tone suggested she didn't really believe it. Or maybe it was something else. Either way, I think we should head inside now. As we retreated into the warmth and light of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest suddenly seemed alive with hidden presences, secrets, and dangers we were only beginning to understand. That night, as I lay in my bunk trying to sleep, every creak of the cabin and rustle of wind in the trees outside set my nerves on edge. I found myself straining to hear those eerie whispers again, both dreading and half expecting them. But the night passed uneventfully, and as dawn broke I began to wonder if perhaps I had overreacted. Maybe it had all been a product of my imagination, fueled by the stress of camping alone for the first time. Yet as I looked out the window at the misty forest beyond, I couldn't quite convince myself of that. Something was out there, something that defied easy explanation. And I had a feeling that before this trip was over, we might just come face to face with the truth behind the legends of the forest folk. The next few days passed in a strange mix of normalcy and underlying tension. On the surface, our group continued with the planned activities: hiking, fishing in the nearby stream, telling stories around the campfire at night. But for Sarah and me, every excursion into the woods was tinged with a heightened awareness, a constant vigilance for anything out of the ordinary. We didn't see anything as overtly strange as the tracks we'd found that first day, but there were oddities. Moments when the forest would fall unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath. Glimpses of movement just at the edge of our vision, gone when we turned to look directly. Once while on a hike, I could have sworn I heard that eerie whispering again, carried on the wind, but it was gone before I could be sure. Sarah and I kept these observations to ourselves, not wanting to alarm the others without concrete evidence. But I could tell the strain was starting to wear on both of us. We were jumpy, quick to startle at unexpected noises, our eyes constantly scanning the trees around us. It was on the fourth day of our stay that things took a more dramatic turn. We had split into two groups for the day. Tom, Lisa, and Matt had gone for a longer hike to a nearby waterfall, while Sarah, myself, and the remaining two members of our group, Mike and Emily, had opted for a more leisurely day of fishing and exploring closer to the cabin. We were following the stream that ran near the cabin, looking for a good spot to set up our fishing gear, when Emily suddenly stopped short. "Guys," she said, her voice tight with alarm, "look at this." We gathered around where she was pointing. There, in the soft mud of the stream bank, was a set of footprints. They were similar to the ones we'd found on the ridge, elongated, with strange proportions that didn't match any animal we knew. But these were fresher, the edges still crisp and well-defined. What made these?" Mike asked, his earlier skepticism about our caution in the woods now replaced by clear unease. Sarah and I exchanged a glance. This was the moment we'd been half expecting, half dreading, concrete evidence that something unusual was indeed in these woods. "We're not sure," Sarah said carefully, "but we've seen tracks like these before, and there have been other things, strange noises, movements in the trees. As Sarah began to explain some of our observations over the past few days, I found my attention drawn to the forest around us. The usual background noise of birds and small animals had gone quiet, replaced by an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. And then I saw it, just for a moment, a flash of movement between the trees. A figure, tall and lean, moving with an unnatural fluidity. It was there and gone so quickly I might have thought I imagined it, if not for the sharp intake of breath from Emily that told me she'd seen it too. "We need to get back to the cabin," I said, cutting off the ongoing discussion. "Now." Something in my tone must have conveyed the urgency I felt, because no one argued. We quickly gathered our gear and set off back toward the cabin at a brisk pace. As we walked, I could feel eyes on us. The sensation of being watched was so intense it was almost physical, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threats, every rustle in the underbrush a cause for alarm. We were about halfway back to the cabin when we heard it, that same eerie whispering I'd heard in my tent that first night. But this time, it wasn't just me. From the wide-eyed looks of shock and fear on the faces of my companions, I knew they could hear it too. The whispers seemed to come from all around us, a cacophony of unintelligible sounds that were somehow both enticing and terrifying. They rose and fell in pitch, sometimes sounding almost melodic, other times harsh and guttural. "Run!" Sarah shouted, breaking the spell of fear that had momentarily frozen us in place. We took off at a sprint, our fishing gear forgotten in our haste to escape. The forest seemed to come alive around us, branches reaching out as if to grab us, roots rising up to trip our feet. The whispers followed us, sometimes seeming to come from right beside us, other times from far away. As we ran, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, tall, lithe figures darting between the trees with impossible speed and grace. But every time I tried to look directly at them, they vanished, leaving me questioning if I'd really seen anything at all. We burst out of the tree line into the clearing where the cabin stood, gasping for breath and wild-eyed with fear. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the whispers had been. It was as if we'd crossed some invisible boundary, beyond which our pursuers couldn't or wouldn't follow. What was that?" Emily panted, her face pale with shock. Before anyone could answer, the cabin door burst open. Tom, Lisa, and Matt spilled out, their expressions a mix of concern and confusion. "We heard shouting," Matt said, hurrying towards us. "What happened? Are you guys okay?" Sarah and I exchanged a look. There was no hiding it now. We had to tell them everything. As we sat around the cabin's main room, mugs of hot tea in hand to calm our nerves, Sarah and I took turns explaining everything that had happened since my first night alone in the woods. We told them about the whispers, the strange tracks, the fleeting glimpses of impossible creatures moving through the trees. To their credit, our friends listened without interruption, their expressions growing more serious with each revelation. When we finished, there was a long moment of silence as everyone processed what they'd heard. "So," Tom said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "you're saying there are, what, some kind of forest creatures out there, watching us, following us?" I nodded, bracing myself for disbelief or ridicule. But to my surprise, Tom just nodded thoughtfully. "You know," he said slowly, "I thought I saw something weird yesterday on our hike to the waterfall. A figure in the trees, moving faster than anything I've ever seen. I told myself I was imagining things, but now..." One by one, the others chimed in with their own stories. Odd experiences they'd dismissed or rationalized away over the past few days. A strange silence falling over the forest, unexplained noises in the night, a feeling of being watched. "Okay," Matt said, taking charge as he often did in difficult situations. "So, assuming all of this is real, what do we do? Do we leave?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Part of me wanted nothing more than to pack up and get as far away from these woods as possible. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and the unknown, was reluctant to leave without answers. "I don't think we should leave," Sarah said, voicing my own thoughts. "At least not yet. Whatever these beings are, they haven't actually harmed us. They seem curious about us, maybe even trying to communicate in their own way." "Are you suggesting we try to make contact?" Lisa asked, her voice a mix of fear and excitement. Sarah shrugged. "Maybe. Or at least, maybe we could try to understand them better. We have 2 more days before we're supposed to leave. We could use that time to observe, to gather more information." There was a murmur of discussion as everyone considered this idea. I could see the fear in their eyes, but also a growing curiosity. We had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the world. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. "If we're going to do this," I said, "we need to be smart about it. No one goes into the woods alone. We stay in pairs or groups at all times, and we need some way to document what we see and hear." The others nodded in agreement. We spent the next hour planning our approach, deciding on safety protocols and discussing how best to record our observations. As night fell, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. We were no longer just on a casual camping trip. We had become investigators of the unknown, explorers on the edge of a mystery that defied explanation. That night, as I lay in my bunk unable to sleep, I found myself straining to hear those eerie whispers again. But the night remained silent, as if the forest and its mysterious inhabitants were holding their breath, waiting to see what we would do next. Little did we know our decision to stay and investigate would lead us down a path of discovery and danger beyond anything we could have imagined. The true nature of the forest folk was about to be revealed, and with it, a truth that would change our understanding of the world forever. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the autumn air carrying a hint of wood smoke from our cabin's chimney. We gathered around the kitchen table, going over our plan one last time before venturing out into the forest. We had decided to split into 2 groups. Sarah, Mike, and I would head towards the area where we had first encountered the strange tracks and heard the whispers. Matt, Lisa, Emily, and Tom would stay closer to the cabin, keeping watch and maintaining a base of operations. As we prepared to leave, Matt handed each of us a small device. "2-way radios," he explained. "Keep in constant contact. If anything happens, anything at all, you let us know immediately." We nodded, the weight of the radios in our hands a reassuring link to safety. With a final glance back at the cabin, Sarah, Mike, and I set off into the woods. The forest seemed different now that we were actively looking for signs of the unknown. Every shadow held potential secrets, every unexpected sound a possible clue. We moved slowly, our senses on high alert, cameras and voice recorders at the ready. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. We found a few more of the strange tracks, photographing them meticulously and taking measurements. But of the creatures themselves, we saw no sign. It was nearing midday when everything changed. We had stopped in a small clearing to rest and eat a quick lunch, when Sarah suddenly stiffened, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the tree line. "There," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you see it?" I followed her gaze, my heart pounding. At first I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then slowly a figure seemed to materialize from the very bark of a large oak tree. It was tall, easily 7 feet in height, with a slender, almost ethereal build. Its skin was a mottled pattern of browns and greens that seemed to shift and change as it moved, blending perfectly with the forest around it. But it was the face that truly captured my attention. Large, almond-shaped eyes of a deep forest green regarded us with unmistakable intelligence. There was no nose that I could discern, and the mouth was just a thin line that didn't move as a series of soft whistles and clicks emanated from it. "Oh my God," Mike breathed beside me. "It's real. They're real." As if in response to his words, more figures began to appear from the surrounding trees. 5, then 10, then more than I could count. They moved with an otherworldly grace, their bodies seeming to flow rather than walk. I raised my camera with shaking hands, hardly daring to breathe as I snapped photo after photo. Sarah was whispering a running commentary into her voice recorder while Mike stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. The beings made no move to approach us, but neither did they retreat. They simply stood there watching us with those large, inscrutable eyes. The forest had fallen completely silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, I reached for the radio at my belt. "Matt," I whispered into it. "Are you there? You need to get out here now. We've made contact." There was a burst of static, then Matt's voice came through, tense with excitement and concern. "We're on our way. Don't move. Don't do anything to provoke them." As we waited for the others to arrive, one of the beings, the first one we had seen, took a step forward. Its movement was so fluid it seemed to glide across the forest floor. It stopped about 10 feet away from us, its head tilted slightly to one side in what seemed like curiosity. Then, to our utter amazement, it spoke. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a complex series of whistles, clicks, and what sounded almost like wind through leaves. But underneath it all, I could have sworn I heard words. Not in English, not in any language I recognized, but definitely words. Sarah, her voice shaking with excitement, whispered into her recorder, "They're trying to communicate. They're actually trying to talk to us." As the being continued its strange speech, more of its kind moved forward to join it. They formed a loose semicircle around us, their eyes never leaving our faces. I had the unsettling feeling that they were studying us just as intently as we were studying them. Just then, we heard the sound of running feet and breaking branches. Matt and the others burst into the clearing, their faces flushed with exertion and excitement. They skidded to a halt as they took in the scene before them. For a long moment, humans and forest beings regarded each other in silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, the being who had spoken raised one long-fingered hand in what was unmistakably a gesture of greeting. We stood on the precipice of something monumental, a first contact scenario that would change everything we thought we knew about our world and our place in it. As I raised my own hand in response, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? And how would this encounter change us, all of us, forever? The next few hours passed in a blur of excitement and frantic activity. We set up a makeshift research station in the clearing, cameras and audio equipment trained on our newfound forest companions. The beings seemed content to stay, watching us with those large, enigmatic eyes as we scurried about our tasks. Matt, who had some linguistics background from college, took charge of trying to establish communication. He started with simple gestures, pointing to himself and saying his name, then pointing to various objects and naming them. The forest beings watched intently, occasionally mimicking his gestures with their fluid grace. It was Lisa who made the breakthrough. A biology major, she had been recording the various sounds the beings made, trying to discern patterns. "Guys," she called out excitedly, "I think I've got something." We gathered around her laptop as she played back a series of recordings. "Listen," she said, pointing to the sound waves on the screen. "There's a definite structure here. It's not random noise. This is a language." As we listened more closely, we began to hear it too. The whistles and clicks weren't just random sounds. They had rhythm, repetition, variations that suggested meaning. It was utterly alien, yet undeniably a form of communication. "But how do we decode it?" Tom asked, voicing the question on all our minds. "We start simple," Matt said, a determined glint in his eye. "Basic concepts, yes, no, here, there. We use gestures, pictures, anything we can think of to establish a common ground." And so began one of the most extraordinary afternoons of our lives. We drew pictures in the dirt, acted out simple scenarios, pointed to colors and shapes in our surroundings. The forest beings watched, listened, and gradually began to respond. It was slow going at first. Their concept of language was so different from ours that finding common ground was a challenge. But as the hours passed, we began to make progress. We learned that a certain whistle-click combination meant yes, while another meant no. We figured out how they referred to themselves and to us. As night began to fall, We had established a rudimentary form of communication. It was limited, fraught with potential misunderstandings, but it was a start. We had taken the first steps towards bridging the gap between our world and theirs. But our excitement was tempered by a growing awareness of the enormity of what we had discovered. These beings, intelligent, communicative, utterly non-human, had been living alongside us, undetected for who knows how long. What did that mean for our understanding of the world, of ourselves? As we prepared to return to the cabin for the night, the leader of the forest beings, the one who had first approached us, made a series of sounds we had come to associate with return and sun. We took it to mean they wanted us to come back tomorrow. "We'll be back," Matt assured them, using a combination of words and gestures we hoped they would understand. "We have so much more to learn." As we hiked back to the cabin, our minds reeling from the day's events, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the brink of something monumental. We had made first contact with an intelligent, non-human species. The implications were staggering, but as we emerged from the tree line into the clearing where our cabin stood, a sobering thought struck me. What would happen when our trip was over, when we had to return to the world beyond these woods? How could we possibly keep this discovery a secret, and what would happen if we didn't? As we settled in for the night, our conversation turned to these weighty questions. We were no longer just a group of friends on a camping trip. We had become the keepers of a secret that could change the world. The question was, what were we going to do about it? The next morning we gathered around the kitchen table, mugs of steaming coffee in hand, to discuss our next steps. The excitement of discovery had given way to a more somber mood as we grappled with the implications of what we had found. "We can't just leave and pretend this never happened," Sarah said, voicing what we were all thinking. "These beings, they're intelligent. They're trying to communicate with us. We have a responsibility to them and to the world to pursue this further." "But how?" Lisa asked. "Our trip ends tomorrow. We all have jobs, lives to get back to. And even if we could stay, how long before someone notices we're gone, before people start asking questions?" Matt leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's also the question of whether we should tell anyone at all. Think about it. If word gets out about intelligent, non-human beings living in these woods, what happens then? Scientists, media, government agencies, they'd all descend on this place. The forest beings' way of life would be destroyed." A heavy silence fell over the group as we contemplated this. He had a point. Our discovery, if revealed, would change everything, not just for us, but for the forest beings as well. "But don't we have an obligation to share this knowledge?" Tom argued. "This could revolutionize our understanding of intelligence, of life itself. It could change how we view our place in the world." The debate raged on, each of us grappling with the ethical implications of our discovery. Did we have the right to keep this secret? Did we have the right to reveal it? There were no easy answers. In the end, we came to a tentative decision. We would continue our attempts at communication for the remainder of our stay, gathering as much information as we could. But we would not, for now, reveal our discovery to the outside world. We would take time to consider all the implications, to try to understand more about the forest beings and their wishes before making any irreversible decisions. With this uneasy compromise reached, we prepared to head back into the forest. But as we stepped outside, we were met with an unexpected sight. The leader of the forest beings was standing at the edge of the clearing alone, waiting for us. It made a series of sounds we had come to associate with follow and important. Then it turned and began to move into the forest with that fluid grace that still took our breath away. Exchanging glances of excitement and trepidation, we grabbed our gear and followed. Whatever the forest beings wanted to show us, we sensed it would be significant. Little did we know we were about to uncover secrets that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the history of our world and our place in it. As we ventured deeper into the forest than we had ever gone before, following our enigmatic guide, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a threshold, Whatever we discovered today, there would be no going back. Our lives, and potentially the lives of everyone on Earth, were about to change forever. We exchanged wide-eyed looks of disbelief before following our guide into the passage. The tunnel was dark at first, but soon began to glow with a soft blue-green light emanating from bioluminescent fungi lining the walls. The air grew warmer and more humid as we descended deeper into the earth. After what seemed like an eternity of twists and turns, the tunnel suddenly opened up, and we found ourselves standing on a ledge overlooking a vast underground cavern. What we saw took our breath away. Spread out before us was an entire city, unlike anything we had ever seen before. Structures that seemed to be part organic and part crystalline rose from the cavern floor, their surfaces shimmering with the same bioluminescent light we had seen in the tunnel. Bridges of what looked like living wood spanned between the structures, and throughout the city we could see hundreds of forest beings going about their daily lives. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered beside me, her voice filled with awe. It's incredible." Our guide made a series of sounds that we had come to associate with home and city. It gestured for us to follow as it led us down a winding path to the cavern floor. As we entered the city proper, we were struck by the seamless integration of nature and technology. The buildings seemed to grow out of the very rock, their forms fluid and organic. We saw devices that appeared to manipulate light and sound in ways we couldn't comprehend, and everywhere there was a sense of harmony with the surrounding environment. The forest beings we passed regarded us with obvious curiosity, but none seemed alarmed by our presence. Our guide led us to a large central structure that towered above the others. Inside, we found ourselves in a vast chamber filled with what appeared to be holographic displays and strange pulsating crystals. An older-looking forest being, its skin a deeper shade of green with patterns that reminded me of tree rings, approached us. It made a series of complex sounds, which our guide seemed to translate for us using the rudimentary communication system we had established. From what we could gather, this was some kind of council chamber, and the elder being was a leader of their society. They had been observing us for a long time, debating whether to make contact. Our camping trip and my solo encounter that first night had finally prompted them to reach out. As we struggled to communicate, piecing together meaning from gestures and the limited vocabulary we had established, a shocking truth began to emerge. These beings, this hidden civilization, had been here for far longer than we could have imagined. Their history spoke of a time before humans, of watching our species grow and spread across the world. They had remained hidden all this time, watching and learning, but never interfering, until now. Something had changed, something that had prompted them to finally reveal themselves to us. As the elder being continued its explanation, aided by our guide's translations, we began to understand the gravity of the situation. The forest beings weren't just showing us their home out of curiosity or friendliness. They needed our help. The natural world, which they were intrinsically connected to, was changing. They had sensed it long before our scientists had begun to talk about climate change and environmental degradation. The balance was shifting, and they feared for the future of not just their own kind, but all life on Earth. They had chosen to reveal themselves to us because they believed that together we might find a way to address these challenges. Their ancient wisdom and deep connection to nature, combined with human innovation and adaptability, could be the key to ensuring a future for all species on our planet. As this realization sank in, I looked around at my friends. Their faces reflected the same mix of awe, excitement, and trepidation that I felt. We had come to these woods for a simple camping trip, and now found ourselves standing in an ancient, hidden city, being asked to help save the world. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, but so was the potential. We were on the brink of a collaboration that could change the course of history, that could redefine humanity's relationship with the natural world. As the elder being finished its explanation, it extended a hand towards us in a gesture that needed no translation. It was an offer, an invitation to join them in their quest to restore balance to our shared world. With hearts pounding and minds reeling, we reached out to accept. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles we might face in bridging our two worlds, we knew that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. A journey that would not only change our lives, but potentially the future of our entire planet. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity as we attempted to establish a more comprehensive method of communication with the forest beings. Matt and Lisa worked tirelessly, combining their knowledge of linguistics and biology to create a rudimentary translation system. It was far from perfect, but it allowed us to begin exchanging more complex ideas. As our understanding grew, so did our amazement at the depth and breadth of the forest beings' knowledge. They had been observing and documenting the changes in the environment for centuries, accumulating a wealth of data that dwarfed our own scientific records. Through a combination of their holographic technology and our digital devices, we began to piece together a picture of the global changes they had observed. The patterns were clear and deeply troubling. The delicate balance of ecosystems worldwide was shifting at an unprecedented rate, with consequences that were only beginning to manifest. "This is incredible," Tom murmured as we pored over the data. "With this information, we could revolutionize our understanding of climate change and its effect." But the forest beings' concerns went beyond just climate change. They spoke of subtle shifts in the Earth's magnetic field, changes in the migration patterns of animals we had thought were fixed, and disturbances in the natural cycles of growth and decay that formed the foundation of forest ecosystems. As night fell in the world above, we realized we had been in the hidden city for hours. The concept of time seemed different here, measured more in the ebb and flow of natural cycles than in minutes and hours. The elder being, which we had come to understand, held a position similar to a tribal chief or mayor, invited us to stay in the city overnight. We were shown to a series of chambers that had been adapted for our comfort, with bioluminescent lights that could be adjusted to our preference, and strange but surprisingly comfortable organic furniture. As we settled in for the night, our minds buzzing with all we had learned, we gathered to discuss our next steps. "We can't just go back to our normal lives after this," Sarah said, voicing what we were all thinking. "We have a responsibility now, not just to the forest beings, but to the entire planet." Matt nodded in agreement. "But we need to be smart about how we proceed. If we go public with this information too quickly, without a solid plan, it could cause panic or worse, lead to the forest beings being exploited or harmed." We debated long into the night, weighing our options and responsibilities. By the time exhaustion finally overcame us, we had the outline of a plan. We would return to our world, but not to our old lives. Instead, we would use our respective skills and connections to begin laying the groundwork for a gradual revelation of what we had discovered. Tom, with his background in environmental science, would begin compiling and analyzing the data the forest beings had shared. Lisa would use her biology expertise to study the unique physiology of the forest beings and their symbiotic relationship with their environment. Matt would work on developing more advanced translation tools to facilitate better communication. As for Sarah and me, we would be the liaisons between our world and theirs, coordinating our efforts and ensuring that the wishes and well-being of the forest beings remained at the forefront of our endeavors. As I drifted off to sleep that night, in a chamber deep beneath the Earth's surface, surrounded by the gentle pulsing of bioluminescent light, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation about the path that lay ahead. We were about to embark on a journey that would change not just our lives, but potentially the course of human history. The once simple camping trip had become the beginning of an extraordinary adventure, one that would challenge our understanding of the world and our place in it. As I closed my eyes, I wondered what new wonders and challenges the dawn would bring in this hidden city beneath the forest. The next morning, or what passed for morning in the subterranean city, we were awakened by our forest being guide. It was time for us to return to the surface world. Our originally planned departure date had arrived, and we knew that staying longer would raise suspicions among our families and colleagues. As we prepared to leave, the elder being approached us once more. Through our improved but still imperfect communication, it conveyed a message of hope and responsibility. We were now bearers of a profound secret, custodians of a partnership that could shape the future of our planet. The forest beings would continue to monitor the changes in the environment and would be in contact with us through means they would reveal later. With heavy hearts and minds brimming with new knowledge, we bid farewell to the hidden city. Our guide led us back through the winding tunnels to the forest above. As we emerged into the dappled sunlight of the woodland, it felt as though we were awakening from a dream. But the small communication device the forest beings had given us, a crystal that seemed to pulse with an inner light, was a tangible reminder of the reality of our experience. The hike back to our cabin was filled with quiet contemplation. Each of us was lost in thought, grappling with the enormity of what we had discovered and the task that lay ahead of us. The forest, which had seemed so mysterious and foreboding just days ago, now felt like a second home, a place filled with hidden wonders and ancient wisdom. As we packed up our belongings and prepared to leave the cabin, we made a pact. We would stay in constant contact, coordinating our efforts to gradually introduce the world to the existence of the forest beings and the critical environmental information they had shared. We also vowed to protect the location of the hidden city, understanding the importance of maintaining the forest beings' privacy and security. The drive back to civilization was surreal. The mundane sights of highways, gas stations, and suburban sprawl seemed somehow both familiar and alien after our extraordinary experience. We parted ways with promises to begin our work immediately, each of us heading back to our respective lives with a new sense of purpose. In the weeks and months that followed, we threw ourselves into our tasks. Tom began publishing papers on new environmental data, careful to obscure its true source. Lisa made breakthroughs in her research, introducing concepts of symbiotic biology that were inspired by the forest beings, but presented as theoretical models. Matt worked tirelessly on advancing translation algorithms, ostensibly for use in decoding animal communication. Sarah and I coordinated it all, using the crystal communication device to stay in touch with the forest beings and ensure our actions aligned with their wishes. We also began carefully sounding out potential allies, open-minded scientists, environmentalists, and policymakers who might be receptive to the truth when the time came to reveal it. It wasn't easy. There were times when the burden of our secret felt overwhelming, when the magnitude of the task before us seemed insurmountable. But in those moments, we would remind ourselves of the hidden city beneath the trees, of the ancient and wise beings who had entrusted us with their friendship and their knowledge. As the seasons changed and our work progressed, we knew we were on the cusp of something monumental. The day would soon come when we would need to reveal the truth to the world. But for now, we worked in secret, guided by the wisdom of the forest and the hope for a better future. Our camping trip had ended, but our true journey, one that would reshape our understanding of the world and our place in it, had only just begun. 5 years have passed since that fateful camping trip that changed our lives forever. In that time, we've made remarkable progress, but our work is far from over. The world is slowly becoming aware of the forest beings, though the full truth is still known only to a select few. We've carefully orchestrated a series of discoveries and breakthroughs that have gradually introduced aspects of their knowledge and existence to the scientific community and the public at large. The environmental data we've released has sparked a global movement for change, leading to unprecedented cooperation in addressing climate change and habitat preservation. The symbiotic technologies we've developed, based on the forest beings' innovations, are revolutionizing sustainable energy and agriculture. Our team has grown. We've carefully vetted and brought in experts from various fields, each one sworn to secrecy but dedicated to our cause. The forest beings, too, have become more active partners, with small delegations now working directly with human scientists in secure, hidden locations. As for the hidden city and the majority of the forest beings, they remain a secret, protected by those of us who understand the importance of maintaining their privacy and way of life. But their influence is felt across the world, guiding us towards a more harmonious relationship with our planet. There have been challenges, of course, skeptics who question our findings, corporations that resist the changes we're advocating, governments wary of the shift in power dynamics that comes with such revolutionary knowledge. But with each passing day, more people are coming to understand the critical importance of the message we're sharing. As I stand here now at the edge of the forest where our journey began, I'm filled with a sense of hope. The path ahead is still long and uncertain, but we're no longer walking it alone. We have allies both seen and unseen, a coalition of humans and forest beings working together towards a common goal. The world is changing, awakening to the deeper truths and connections that bind all living things. And it all started with a simple camping trip, a journey into the unknown that became a passage to a new understanding of our place in the cosmos. As I turn to rejoin my friends, my fellow guardians of this precious secret, I can't help but smile. The adventure that began in these woods continues, and the best is yet to come. The future, like the forest itself, is full of mystery, wonder, and the promise of discoveries yet to be made. The steering wheel was cool under my palms as I guided my old Subaru along the winding mountain road. My name is Olivia Chen, and I've been planning this solo photography trip to Echo Ridge for months. As a wildlife photographer, I'm used to solitude, but something about this journey felt different. The sun was sinking below the jagged peaks of the Rockies as I finally pulled into the nearly empty trailhead parking lot. Only a dusty red pickup truck kept my car company. I stepped out, breathing in the crisp mountain air, tinged with the scent of pine and distant snow. I did one last check of my gear: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, first aid kit, camera equipment, and enough food for 3 days. Everything was in order. I was just about to hit the trail when a Forest Service vehicle rumbled into the lot. A woman who looked to be in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes stepped out. "Evening," she called. "Heading up the trail?" I nodded, adjusting my backpack. "That's the plan. Is there anything I should know?" The ranger, whose name tag read Diane, frowned slightly. "Actually, yes. We've had some concerning incidents recently. A hiker disappeared last week and we're still searching for him." A chill ran down my spine, despite the warm evening. "Disappeared? What happened?" Diane shook her head. "We're not sure. Ryan Cooper, 32, experienced outdoorsman. His partner reported him missing when he didn't return as scheduled. We found his campsite about 6 miles up, everything in order, but no sign of him." I swallowed hard. "That's unsettling. Any theories?" "Nothing concrete," Diane replied. "No signs of animal attack or foul play. It's as if he just vanished into thin air." I weighed my options. I'd been looking forward to this trip for so long, but the news was concerning. "I appreciate the heads up. I think I'll still go, but I'll be extra careful." Diane nodded, though she looked uneasy. "All right, but please stick to the main trail and check in at the ranger station when you return. Take this as well." She handed me a small device. "It's a satellite emergency beacon. Don't hesitate to use it if you encounter any trouble." I clipped the beacon to my pack, thanked her, and set off down the trail. As I walked, the fading light cast long shadows across my path, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I didn't fully understand. As darkness settled over the forest, I found a suitable clearing and set up camp. The routine was familiar: pitching the tent, rolling out my sleeping bag, gathering wood for a small fire. But tonight, each snap of a twig under my feet made me jump. I started a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and settled down to review the day's photos on my camera. The night was alive with sounds: an owl's hoot, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But underneath it all was an unsettling silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to dismiss it as nerves amplified by the ranger's story, but my instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right. I was about to turn in when I heard it, a sharp crack echoing through the trees. It was the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under weight. My heart began to race. I quickly extinguished my fire and retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly. I lay still in my sleeping bag, every sense on high alert. For a long while there was nothing. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. They were too regular, too purposeful to be an animal. I reached for my flashlight and the emergency beacon with trembling hands. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, afraid to make even the slightest sound. A shadow fell across the tent fabric. Someone was standing there. My finger hovered over the beacon's button, but before I could press it, the shadow moved away, and I heard the footsteps retreating into the forest. I remained frozen, heart racing, for what seemed like hours. Every sound, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a fresh wave of fear through me. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into a restless sleep filled with dreams of dark forests and shadowy figures. I woke at dawn, momentarily disoriented. For a second I hoped the night's events had been a dream, but as I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, reality came crashing back. There, in the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints. Large, boot-shaped prints that weren't mine. They circled my tent exactly as I'd heard in the night. My hand shook as I photographed the prints. I needed evidence, needed to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. As I surveyed the area, something caught my eye, a metallic glint near the clearing's edge. Approaching cautiously, I found a small object half buried in the leaves. It was a compass, its glass cracked, but the needle still swinging freely. My mind raced. Could this belong to the missing hiker? I carefully bagged the compass, intending to hand it over to the rangers. But as I stood, a chilling thought struck me. I was no longer alone in these woods, and whoever was out there might not want this compass found. I needed to get back to the trailhead, back to safety. I quickly broke camp, my photographer's curiosity at war with my growing sense of dread. Part of me wanted to press on, to unravel this mystery, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. As I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from the dense forest on either side. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent my heart racing. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. I had been hiking for about an hour, my nerves frayed and my senses on high alert, when I heard it. Footsteps on the trail behind me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps accelerated too. I was about to break into a run when a voice called out, "Hey, wait up!" I spun around, my hand on the emergency beacon. A man was jogging up the trail towards me. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with a scruffy beard and a backpack similar to mine. "Sorry if I startled you," he said, slightly out of breath. "I'm Derek. I saw your campfire last night but didn't want to intrude. Thought I'd catch up and say hello this morning." I studied him warily, my body tense and ready to run. "I'm Olivia. Were you near my camp last night?" Derek looked confused. "No, I was camped about a half-mile back. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, then decided to trust my instincts. I told Derek about the footsteps, the prints, and the compass I'd found. As I spoke, I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of deception. Derek's face grew serious. "That's unsettling. I heard about the missing hiker from the rangers. Do you think there could be a connection?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm heading back to report what I found. It doesn't feel safe up here." Derek nodded. "Mind if I join you? I don't like the idea of anyone being alone out here right now." I agreed, relieved to have company but still wary. As we hiked back together, I couldn't help but wonder, was Derek really who he claimed to be? Or was he somehow connected to the strange events unfolding in these mountains? As Derek and I made our way down the trail, the sky began to darken ominously. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and carrying the scent of rain. "Looks like a storm's coming," Derek observed, glancing up at the roiling clouds. "We should find shelter soon." I nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The last thing we needed was to be caught in a downpour, especially with night approaching. We quickened our pace, searching for any suitable shelter. That's when I spotted it, a small cabin, barely visible through the dense foliage. "Look," I said, pointing, "maybe we can wait out the storm there." Derek squinted in the direction I was pointing. "Good eye, let's check it out." As we approached the cabin, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. It looked old and weathered, clearly long abandoned. The wooden walls were gray with age, and vines crept up the sides. Derek tried the door. To our surprise, it swung open with a creak. We stepped inside just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The interior of the cabin was sparse: a rusty wood stove in one corner, a rickety table and chairs, and a narrow cot against the far wall. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. "Looks like no one's been here in years," I said, setting down my backpack. Derek nodded, moving to the window to peer out at the worsening storm. "We might be here for a while. Should we try to get a fire going in that stove?" I agreed, and we set about gathering what dry wood we could find. As Derek worked on starting the fire, I explored the cabin more thoroughly. That's when I noticed something odd: a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden under an old rug. "Derek," I called, my voice shaky, "you need to see this." He came over, his eyebrows rising as he saw what I was pointing at. "A cellar, maybe?" We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Could this be connected to the disappearances? With trembling hands, I reached for the iron ring on the trap door. It was heavy, but with Derek's help we managed to lift it. A wave of musty air hit us as we peered into the darkness below. Derek shone his flashlight down, revealing a ladder leading into a small cellar. "I'm going down there," I said, surprised by my own boldness. Derek looked uncertain. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I wasn't sure at all, but something was driving me forward. "I need to know what's down there. Watch my back." He nodded, and I began to descend the ladder. The cellar was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I gasped. The walls were covered in maps, photographs, and scribbled notes. In the center of the room was a table strewn with more papers and what looked like camping gear. "Derek, you need to see this," I called up. He climbed down, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "What is all this?" I picked up one of the papers from the table. It was a list of names and dates. With a chill, I realized they were all dates of reported disappearances in the area, going back years. "I think we just stumbled onto something big," I whispered. Suddenly we heard a noise from above, the creak of the cabin door opening. We froze, looking at each other in panic. Someone else was here. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor above us. Derek quickly switched off his flashlight, plunging us into darkness. We huddled in silence, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped, right above the trapdoor. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give us away. Then slowly the trapdoor began to open. Time seemed to stand still as the trapdoor inched open. A beam of light pierced the darkness, and I instinctively pressed myself against the damp cellar wall, trying to become one with the shadows. Derek was beside me, his breathing shallow and controlled. A figure descended the ladder, and I felt my heart skip a beat as I recognized the silver-streaked hair. It was Diane, the ranger from the trailhead. She reached the bottom of the ladder and swept her flashlight around the cellar, the beam catching the glint of fear in our eyes as it passed over us. "Olivia, Derek?" Her voice was a mix of surprise and, was that relief? "What are you doing down here?" We stepped forward. confusion written across our faces. "We could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice shakier than I'd like. Diane sighed heavily, her shoulders sagging. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone stumbled onto this." She moved to the table in the center of the room and switched on an old oil lamp, casting a warm glow around the cellar. "What is all this?" Derek asked, gesturing to the maps and photos covering the walls. Diane ran a hand through her hair, suddenly looking much older than she had at the trailhead. "It's a long story and not a pretty one, but I suppose you deserve to know now that you're here." She began to explain, and as she spoke, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The disappearances in Echo Ridge weren't random accidents or the work of some mysterious predator. They were calculated, deliberate acts. "There's a group," Diane said, her voice low. "They call themselves the Guardians of the Wild. They believe that humans have no place in these mountains, that we're destroying the natural balance, and they've taken it upon themselves to discourage people from coming here." I felt sick to my stomach. "You mean they're responsible for the missing hikers, for Ryan Cooper?" Diane nodded grimly. "They don't usually harm people, just scare them, make them think the mountains are haunted or dangerous. But lately they've become more aggressive. Ryan, he stumbled onto something he shouldn't have. I've been trying to find him to get him out before it's too late." "And this place?" Derek asked, looking around the cellar. "My base of operations," Diane replied. "I've been tracking the Guardians for years, trying to gather enough evidence to bring them down. But they're careful, and they have supporters in high places." My mind was reeling. "So last night, at my campsite—" "That was me," Diane admitted. "I was trying to scare you off the trail. I'm sorry, but I thought it was safer than letting you wander into their territory." 1,000 questions swirled in my mind, but before I could voice any of them, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Voices coming from outside the cabin. Diane's eyes widened. "They're here. We need to move, now." She quickly gathered some papers from the table and stuffed them into her pack. "There's a tunnel," she said, moving to the far wall and pushing aside a heavy crate to reveal a dark opening. "It leads to a cave system. It's our only way out." As the voices grew closer, we had no choice but to trust her. We grabbed our packs and followed Diane into the darkness, the sound of the cabin door bursting open echoing behind us as we fled into the unknown depths of Echo Ridge. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the air thick with the musty smell of earth and decay. We moved as quickly as we dared, our path illuminated only by the weak beams of our flashlights. The voices from the cabin grew fainter as we delved deeper into the mountain. "Where does this tunnel lead?" I whispered to Diane, who was leading our small group. "To an old mining complex," she replied, her voice barely audible. "The Guardians don't know about it. At least I don't think they do. It's our best chance of getting out of here undetected." We continued in silence, the only sounds our labored breathing and the occasional drip of water from the tunnel ceiling. I tried to keep track of our twists and turns, but soon lost all sense of direction in the pitch-black maze. After what felt like hours, the tunnel began to widen, and I could feel a change in the air. It was fresher somehow. Suddenly, Diane stopped. "We're here," she said, her flashlight beam revealing a rusty metal door set into the rock face. With some effort, we managed to push the door open, its hinges protesting loudly. We stepped through into a vast cavern, the beams of our flashlights barely penetrating the darkness. The air was cool and damp, with a faint metallic scent that hinted at the area's mining history. "Welcome to the Echo Ridge mine," Diane said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "It's been abandoned for decades, but it might just be our salvation tonight." As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could make out the remnants of mining equipment scattered around. Rusted carts, broken pickaxes, and rotting support beams. It was like stepping back in time. "We should be safe here for now," Derek said, shining his light around the cavern. "But what's our next move?" Diane pulled out a weathered map from her pack. "There's an old emergency exit that leads out to a different part of the mountain. If we can reach it, we should be able to circle back to the ranger station without the Guardians catching on. As Diane studied the map, I couldn't help but voice the question that had been nagging at me. Diane, how did you get involved in all this? Why are you working alone? She sighed heavily, her face etched with weariness in the harsh light of our flashlights. It's a long story, but the short version is that my brother was one of the first to disappear in these mountains. The official investigation went nowhere, so I joined the Forest Service to find answers. Over time, I uncovered the Guardians' activities, but I didn't have enough evidence to go to the authorities. And to be honest, I wasn't sure who I could trust. Her revelation hung in the air, the weight of her solitary mission palpable in the silence of the cavern. Well, you're not alone anymore, I said firmly, surprising myself with my resolve. Derek nodded in agreement. A ghost of a smile crossed Diane's face. Thank you. Now let's get moving. We have a long way to go, and I'm not sure how much of a head start we have. We set off into the depths of the mine, our footsteps echoing off the rocky walls. The path was treacherous, littered with debris and unexpected drops. More than once we had to help each other across gaps where the floor had caved in, revealing dizzying depths below. As we navigated through the labyrinthine tunnels, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every echo sounded like distant footsteps. The oppressive darkness played tricks on our minds, and the tension was palpable. After what felt like hours of walking, we reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3 separate paths. Diane consulted her map, her brow furrowed in concentration. The exit should be down the right path, she said, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. As we were about to head down the right tunnel, a sound froze us in our tracks. It was faint, but unmistakable. Voices coming from the tunnel behind us. They found the entrance, Derek whispered, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. Run, Diane commanded, and we took off down the right tunnel, our earlier caution forgotten in the face of immediate danger. We ran through the darkness, our flashlights bouncing wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The voices behind us grew louder, accompanied by the sound of multiple footsteps. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into another large cavern. In the center was an old elevator shaft, a rickety-looking cage hanging precariously from rusted cables. The emergency exit is up there, Diane gasped, pointing to a ledge high above us. That elevator is the only way up. We looked at each other, the same thought crossing all our minds. Could that ancient contraption possibly still work? And even if it did, would it hold our weight? The sound of our pursuers grew closer. We were out of options and out of time. Let's go, I said, stepping towards the elevator. It's our only chance. As we piled into the rusty cage, I couldn't help but wonder if we were trading one danger for another. The door creaked shut behind us, and Diane reached for the control lever. With a groan of protesting metal, the elevator began to move. The ancient elevator shuddered and creaked as it slowly ascended the shaft. Every groan of metal and every jerk of the cage sent my heart racing. I gripped the rusty railing tightly, my knuckles white with tension. Come on, Diane muttered under her breath, her eyes fixed on the approaching ledge above. The voices of our pursuers echoed up the shaft, growing louder with each passing second. They were close, too close. Suddenly, with a sickening lurch, the elevator ground to a halt, still a good 10 feet below the ledge. No, Derek said, frantically pressing the control buttons. But it was no use. The ancient machinery had given up. We'll have to climb, I said, eyeing the distance to the ledge. It wasn't impossible, but it wouldn't be easy either. Without warning, a beam of light shot up the elevator shaft, momentarily blinding us. Our pursuers had reached the bottom. There they are, a gruff voice shouted from below. Olivia, you go first, Diane said, her voice steady despite the dire situation. Derek and I will hold them off. I wanted to argue, to say we should stay together, but I knew there was no time. With shaking hands, I began to climb the metal framework of the elevator shaft. The rusty metal cut into my palms, and my muscles screamed with the effort, but I forced myself to keep moving. Below me, I could hear shouts and the sound of a scuffle. I didn't dare look down. Finally, my hand grasped the edge of the ledge. With one final push, I hauled myself up and over. I turned immediately, ready to help Derek and Diane. Derek was about halfway up, his face a mask of determination. But Diane was still in the elevator cage, grappling with a large man who had managed to climb up. "Diane," I shouted, reaching down towards her. She looked up at me, and in that moment I saw a mix of fear and resolve in her eyes. "Go," she yelled. "Get to the ranger station. Expose them." Before I could respond, she pulled something from her pocket, the compass we had found earlier. With all her might, she hurled it up towards me. I caught it reflexively, confused by her action. "The evidence is inside," Diane shouted. "Now go!" In that moment of distraction, the man she was fighting gained the upper hand. He pushed her hard, and with a terrifying scream, Diane fell backwards out of the elevator cage, disappearing into the darkness below. "No!" Derek and I screamed in unison. The man in the elevator looked up at us, his face twisted in a menacing grin. He reached for the control panel. "Derek, hurry!" I yelled, extending my hand to him. With a burst of energy, Derek scrambled up the last few feet. Just as my hand closed around his wrist, the elevator plummeted downwards, taking our pursuer with it. We lay on the ledge, gasping for breath, the echo of the crash reverberating through the mine. "We have to keep moving," Derek said after a moment, his voice hoarse. I nodded, clutching the compass tightly. Whatever evidence Diane had sacrificed herself for, I was determined to get it out. We found the emergency exit, a narrow tunnel that sloped upwards. As we began our ascent, I couldn't shake the image of Diane's fall from my mind. Her sacrifice had saved us, but at what cost? The tunnel seemed to go on forever, growing narrower and steeper as we climbed. Our progress was slow, hampered by exhaustion and the constant fear of pursuit. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw a glimmer of light ahead. With renewed energy, we scrambled towards it. We emerged into the pre-dawn light, the cool mountain air a shock after the stale atmosphere of the mine. We were on a rocky outcrop, the vast expanse of Echo Ridge spread out below us. But our ordeal was far from over. In the distance, we could hear shouts and see flashlight beams sweeping the forest. The Guardians were still searching for us. "We need to get to the ranger station," I said, pulling out my phone. No signal. Derek nodded grimly. "It's going to be a race against time. Are you ready?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the compass in my pocket and the gravity of Diane's last words. "Let's finish this," I said. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, we set off down the mountain, carrying with us the hope of exposing the dark secrets of Echo Ridge and the heavy burden of Diane's sacrifice. The final leg of our journey was just beginning, and I knew that the true test of our courage and determination lay ahead. Whatever happened, I was resolved to see this through, for Diane, for Ryan Cooper, and for all those who had fallen victim to the shadows of Echo Ridge.